Oh, sure. Yeah, better? All the best, people. No, we're coming to that. Yeah, really. Like we just before. Alright. Thanks. Oh, they have the. Bye. Oh, yeah. So on the motion, this House will allow automated child sex chat simulators online. We have MUTO on government and Maravi on opposition. Without further ado, let's invite the Prime Minister to open the case inside government.
Cool. Right. So, Speaker, the recognition and management of pedophilia versus the ignorance of it all and the total blanket policy where people just generally ignore it as a sexual design is something we have a problem with. This has to be about the balance of rights versus the needs of society, and why we're willing to err on the side of caution by recognizing that pedophilia is an alternative sexual design that we need to recognize as many people have it. What do we think it is? One, we think it's an alternative sexual design and a sexual inclination towards having sex with children. We don't think there's a treatment that's been adapted for it yet. Laws and deterrence only go so far as to demonize that form of sexuality and that sexual inclination, and it's a problem that we have with on-side government. And let's be clear about the status quo as well. Pedophilia at the present moment is nothing but a crime as far as the definitional constitutes in the status quo. But what we hear more often than not are the crimes of pedophilia and the actions that harm children. But what we don't hear are the millions of people who have these types of sexual urges, who have these types of sexual inclinations, but choose to suppress and not act on it. This debate fights for the rights of those people, Mr. Speaker, who have these sort of urges and don't know what to do about it. So let's be clear from the stance of government. We're fine with the pedophilia being a sexual inclination. We're not okay in the act of when people act on it. I'm going to do a couple of things for you. Number one, I'm going to tell you why this is a state necessity to implement this policy. Secondly, why the balance of gratification needs to come hand in hand with the hostile environment that currently exists. And lastly, why the demonization of pedophilia and the entire misunderstanding of an alternative sexual lifestyle needs to happen. Before that, what is the model? We think it's fairly clear cut that the simulator, there won't be any children involved. It's more of, it's for people to generally have these sort of chats where it's a make-believe system where you think you're actually having sex with a child to gratify yourself under those instances. So firstly, why is this a state necessity? Pragmatically, you have to understand that the hostile situation on the ground makes it very, very difficult for these people to achieve any sort of sexual gratification or employ any sort of avenue to have that sort of sexual gratification. The understanding that these people have and the understanding that we employ on them is that they're sick, that they are of a different standard, and that they need help. What we would rather have is to employ a different approach by understanding that there needs to be an avenue of expression where there are no tangible harms that are achieved, sit down, and where we can facilitate that social engineering, that these conditions can be dealt with as opposed to the blatant ignorance that we employ now. Secondly, we would tell you under this model is that absence of criminality, it is your fundamental right to seek pleasure in the most fundamental way you can possibly connotate to yourself. Does this naturally violate state law? State law only appeals to the misconduct that happens actively with a child. Insofar as the policy goes, we think that it's perfectly legitimate for people to seek pleasure using these forms of mechanisms, especially since it's an alternative sexual design. Not yet, guys. Later. Secondly, how do we balance the gratification portion of this in a hostile environment? The current unified consensus is that pedophilia, in essence, is something that is abhorrent. We think that's unfair. You go back 50, 60 years, homosexuality was something that had a unified consensus that it was something that was generally abhorrent. We think it's just the same with a different form of alternative lifestyle. But the question then begs, and this is the clincher, will this be the catalyst that translates into action of hurting children? Firstly, we will tell you the current abstinence paradigm that we sought to employ is not the conqueror of dormancy, and in fact it has been proven time and time again, the more you start to employ the idea of abstinence, it doesn't work. But secondly, we tell you the suppression in totality is far worse. Why? Because there's a higher likelihood of eventually needing to emote these sort of sexual experiences or sexual needs as you go along. An example would be like the most celibate men I can think of in the Catholic Church in the Vatican as well, right? So the further suppression and the further propagation of abstinence doesn't necessarily work. In contrast, when there is an avenue for sexual release in the least harmful way, you're able to modulate the tempo of your sexual urges and use these platforms in a way that caters to you without harming the general society. And we think that's the difference here. So even if you want to argue that this is a catalyst to translate to action, we think the current status quo of propagating abstinence in the long term is far more difficult because you're negating the problem as a whole. Thirdly, why the demonization of pedophilia is something that we think is very, very problematic on a number of levels. Firstly, the mere connotation of pedophilia comes with an immediate presumption of guilt. That's where we think we need to change that sort of paradigm, because it feeds into the psyche of the general public and also people who have these sort of urges that I have this and I'm supposed to feel guilty about it. That means you isolate these people off a different standard by showing them there's a certain standard of normalcy that you as a sexual being need to abide to. And that's the problem that we have today. Before I move on, go, Mike.
If it is a legitimate sexual desire, it's contradictory for a state to say the outcome of that desire is illegitimate when you are empowering that desire.
No, Mike. The part that becomes illegitimate about empowering that sexuality is because the outcome of that happens to hurt children. Right? That's the point here. When you actually can provide that form of avenue where the outcome of that sexuality or the expression of that sexuality can happen between you and a simulator, then we think we don't have a problem. I'll hear the rest later. What we think is far more important to establish inside government is that the right to sexual gratification is an inherent right that can be granted through the right avenues, because we're far better off given a mechanism like this versus a total condemnation of you as a sexual being having those types of urges. Because if you are a 17-year-old and you start feeling, you have sexual urges towards certain children, the first thought that's going to come to your mind is an immediate presumption of guilt that I am sick, that there is something wrong with me. While those thoughts may be inherently yours, it is the state's duty to facilitate those forms of thoughts to come back to a certain level of normalcy where we provide those types of avenues. So even if sex isn't a necessity, the total condemnation of this sexuality makes sex a focal point. It makes the idea of pedophilia an ultimate focus under these instances. But lastly, we will tell you that the recognition and management of an already existing form of sexuality is far greater than the total ignorance and the total condemnation of a particular sexuality. Why? For a number of reasons. Number one, you need to start humanizing the government, because there's a certain compassion that you need to transfuse to these people based on their sexual design and sexual connotation. It is ultimately unfair to do to these people what we've done to homosexuals in the past, where we've totally isolated them and obliterated them as far as sexuality is concerned. If we don't harm children and we understand that abstinence and a complete blatant suppression of your sexuality is far more harmful than allowing you to gratify yourself in one way or another, we're very proud of it. Yes.
Okay, we thank the Prime Minister for his speech. Let's invite the Leader of Opposition to open the case for side opposition. Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, it's ironic that in the debate about sex, somebody upstairs is operating a drill. It is even more ironic, ladies and gentlemen, that in Tim's speech, he kept on saying that abstinence is not a doable solution for pedophiles. At the same time, and in the same breath, telling you that it is important to have avenues for escape for these pedophiles in order to express their sexual experiences. The question we have here is, where do you then draw the line? And is sex chat simulators enough, an enough form of escape, and enough enabler in order to curb or in order to uphold the abstinence that they wanted on the government team? Let's just point out as well that a vast majority of their case was just a case about legalizing pedophilia, and not necessarily why, given a context where pedophilia is illegal, that the state should now somehow enable individuals to commit crimes, ladies and gentlemen, or even the visualization of committing those crimes. The stance on the side of opposition is simple, that we have a zero tolerance policy against pedophilia, especially in the current context, and any channels that seek to enable sexual desires of child sex predators. Our view is that when a state makes something illegal, it should then make other things that enable that illegal action illegal as well. We think that their model causes more harm to children and more harm to society. Our model, ladies and gentlemen, is that we will continue the ban on online child pornography, whether that pornography be real, simulated, animated, doesn't matter. We will also continue online surveillance and identification of sex predators, as well as weeding out those predators and putting them under state-run programs where we will then teach them how to curb these sexual desires that are obviously harming children. In my speech, I'm going to talk to you about protecting children and rehabilitating pedophiles, but before that, a few rebuttals. Number one, Tim told you that the perception on pedophiles is something that's very negative. We say, first response, so as long as it remains a crime, we are happy, ladies and gentlemen, that the state is actually delegitimizing these avenues. Secondly, so as long as children have not overwhelmingly consented to these things being online, we don't think that you can do it for them. But then, moving on to my second response, why should the state never enable these avenues of pedophilia? One, we think that a lot of these pedophiles, ladies and gentlemen, don't necessarily have like an overwhelming desire to just have sex with children. Some of them simply fetishize like sexual dominance or submission of others in sexual experience or sexual intercourse. So many pedophiles have successfully been reformed and successfully, learned to suppress their innate predispositions and go on to live healthy lives with their families. Thirdly, we also say that their outlet for all this discourse and all these discussions already exists. We have organizations like the Man-Boy Love Club, Man-Boy Love Association of America, which lobbies for pedophilic rights. We're not going to ban websites who foster academic discussions. So if you want to go on a website and say that you support legalizing child marriages, that's completely fine, but that's completely different than actually enabling those very sexual desires online, ladies and gentlemen. Fourthly, we tell you that the difference between pedophilia and homosexuality or transsexuality is that children are completely disconnected from the decision-making process, ladies and gentlemen. Not only do children lack the physical and emotional maturity to make judgment calls based on their bodily autonomy, but we think that because children are involved in this, children can't vote, children have no finances to give to lobby groups or to lobby in Congress. So if you cannot gain consent from children, that is not the same as not gaining consent from a homosexual or a transsexual, ladies and gentlemen. Before I move on to talking about children, because I really do love them, yes, Tim.
Yeah,
same as when you legalized prostitution. There was no unified consent. You can't just tell me pedophilia is a crime and therefore your case will stand. Recognizing that the act of it is a crime, but pedophilia is a sexual connotation, why are you not willing to grant people their avenue?
Yeah, well, we'll tell you why just giving these people these sex chat simulators is going to cause more harm than good. Firstly, let's understand, ladies and gentlemen, that the goal in this debate is to protect children from sexual predators. It is also the goal of the opposition team to deter child sex preying, as well as making government efforts to rehabilitate sexual criminals a lot more effective. Number one, we tell you this is their model harms this because it normalizes the idea of sexual experiences with children. We think that the nature of these sex chats will be heavily vivid, they will be deeply sexual, and they will be child-centric in nature. So they're going to be these sex chat simulators are going to be talking about like doing it in their school uniforms and like not having pubic hair, ladies and gentlemen. These are going to simply enable the kinds of sexual desires that these people want. Secondly, we tell you that it's bad because it dilutes the message that the state tries to send to these individuals. So on one hand, the state is telling these individuals that you need to suppress your sexual desires, that you cannot, have sex with a child, but at the same time allowing avenues for them to enable that very desire, ladies and gentlemen. It's more likely that these people will visualize these experiences, and because they can already visualize it, and they're already imagining doing it, we don't think that it's going to suppress their desires, ladies and gentlemen. Now, secondly, we think it also provides a gateway to physical actualization of these needs. Why? Because let's talk about the nature of web chats and sex chats, or nature of pornography in and of itself. We think that after a while, the pedophiles who come on these websites are going to be like bored, right? Because they're going to see like the same child sex simulators. They're going to be probably saying the same things. They're calling them by the same names, ladies and gentlemen. And after a while, these things, they're going to get bored of this. That's why, like, not all men watch pornography for the entirety of their lives. What then happens, ladies and gentlemen, is that these pedophiles now see these like virtual world as their real world, ladies and gentlemen. So the norms of the virtual world become their realities, Mr. Speaker. We think that after a while, these individuals are not going to be able to suppress this. They're going to look for a greater high, something that will, like fulfill that underwhelming desire. The example we have here is with things like violent video games, ladies and gentlemen. So sure, violent video games doesn't make everyone violent, but there are some people with deeply violent urges or violent tendencies who, after a while of playing video games and playing it for such a long time, once they get bored of the game, they need a greater rush of adrenaline. They need to enable that desire, ladies and gentlemen, which more likely leads to them going out in public and like physically harming other individuals. Thirdly, we tell you that this validates the notion that children can be sexual objects. So a pedophile who goes online and talks to a sex chat simulator now fantasizes that conversation with another child, ladies and gentlemen. It changes the perception onto them that children can be promiscuous or that children can be up for it, ladies and gentlemen. That's more likely to mean that these pedophiles now go out in public and start trying to engage like children for their sexual desires, Mr. Speaker. Fourthly, we think amongst children, it normalizes the idea of adult-minor sex. Now, trends have already showed that we are trying to educate and make children more aware not to talk to strangers online, or not to give up personal details or talk to strangers about personal things. What we think is going to happen under their model is that children who go on the internet and find these sex chat simulators are now going to think, hey, it's actually all right to talk to a stranger. It's actually all right for me to strip on camera, for a stranger in another country on the other side of the world. It's actually okay for me to offer my body to an adult. What we think this is likely to do is to pressure children, or at least change the perception that children have towards adults, ladies and gentlemen. We think it makes children more likely to accept sexual advances from these sexual predators. For all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, if you care about our sons, our daughters, and our children, then vote for side opposition.
Everyone okay?
When you use phrases like all or nothing or zero tolerance, I want to remind you that you're talking about human beings. What do you mean by zero tolerance for human beings or people with a particular sexual identity? What do you mean about zero tolerance about someone who is born with a particular sexual orientation and who has to struggle with this for the rest of their life? For a horny boy, he can get over it when he gets married. For a horny boy, he can go out there to visit prostitutes. But for pedophilia, so long as the status quo were to criminalize the act of the pedophilia, the only alternative or only avenue for them is to perhaps watch these simulators and derive some form of pleasure out of it. When you come up here and tell me that you want to teach them or you want to brainwash them to change their ways, we say that is crazy. You don't do that for homosexuals, you don't do that for like lesbians and so on and so forth. What is even worse is this. What if your rehabilitation failed? In fact, it's probably going to fail because you're dealing with some of the most fundamental aspects of the people. What are you going to do to them? In this case, what do you mean by zero tolerance? Like, do you use them as tools for your social engineering? I think that is crazy. There's not anything the government can do. The second fallacy they said is that governments can never facilitate desires but clamp down on actions at the same time. That is a lie. We do that all the time. That's the reason why we allow for like the use of pornography. Yes, it may stoke the passion of the guy. Maybe he will masturbate a little bit more. He will fantasize a bit more. Yes, it may stoke the men out there when they go to a prostitute. He may think about the next visit after a particular visit. But we are very serious, no thank you, about the act of rape out there. That's why when they came out here and say that children become sexualized, or men or women become sexualized as a result of that, we are okay with that. Because all your other actions like pornography, R21 movies, also sexualize individuals, and we are okay with this. The most important thing is this, is that when we recognize the vulnerability of the children, then we go and protect the children themselves. We have extremely harsh laws when at a point in time whereby the act of a child having sex with the adult is not under informed consent. And this is probably going to be a policy that will go on further. Next thing they want to say, no thank you, is this, is that at this point in time, they just say that some studies show that people become more and more aggressive sexually without engaging with a more intuitive argument from our side. Just as we don't expect a normal man to actually repress all his sexual desires, and just as how when we see that people go to the extreme of abstinence, for example, the Catholic priest, and we see the counterproductivity of this, we say that we should similarly shouldn't expect that from these pedophiles, right? What makes them so different that you need to have a different double standard out there? No, thank you. And by the way, if these pedophiles think that abstinence is a method to do so, we open the avenue for them. We just are saying that not all of them must go through this particular avenue because everyone is different in that particular situation. No, thank you. So I'm going to move on to my main point of substantive. And before that, I'm just going to say that all the rebuttals to their point about protection of children, all the points about how pedophilia is still going to remain a crime is not mutually exclusive to everything that I'm going to talk about, but their policy is. Let's talk about a few things over here. Sexual minorities undergo an extremely different nature of sexual discovery as compared to the rest of the people. When it comes to homosexuals, they live in an environment of haters, right? And haters will always be haters. The moderate or majority takes a long time to warm up towards them, and during this period, they will be given the cold shoulder. When they do not have any political representatives in parliament, people or the MPs make laws about homosexuality, make laws about pedophiles, without consulting the primary group of people who are involved. Why on earth do you make laws? No, and children, we protect children over here, but why do you also make laws on the other group of people without the consultation over here? I'm going to say that our policy will not change things overnight. It doesn't mean that with our policy, then we will have a pedophile MP out there. But we have to understand that they are the most isolated group of people out there, and they're the most susceptible to, like, for example, other forms of vulnerabilities. No, thank you. So, for a pedophile, and this is, I think, one of my most interesting speeches, I'm going to plot a graph or plot a journey for this person. During your sexual journey, no, thank you, at probably puberty, where you begin to discover your sexual orientation, is also the period of time whereby you need the most affirmation from your parents and from your friends out there. In these particular instances, you also need a variety of materials, whether it's about reading like 50 Shades of Grey, watching soft porn on movies, or converse with like-minded people, or even people who disagree with. All these things form part of your sexual journey. And from the government's point of view, we see this as how a person self-actualizes. At the end of the day, the outcome may not be something that we may necessarily prefer, but this, after all, is the discovery of an individual that everyone should go through. Maybe the initial euphoria for this person when he watches like this simulation means that he decides that this is something that I want to hold on to for the rest of my life. I may not participate in terms of actions in the act of having sex with a child, but I want to hold on to this particular sexual orientation. And this is important. Listen to this. Because when you say that you want to brainwash this group of people, you're essentially saying that people who make these kind of choices, people who are born with this kind of orientation, are not legitimate human beings out there. Because if I were to ask you a simple question, if sexuality is something that is fundamental to you, and equality is fundamental to the state, then what form of sexual equality is there out there when the most important thing in your life is not considered important by the government, but the most important thing in other people's life is considered important to the government out there? So what is the comparison in our case? We don't have panacea out there, but we do a lot of difference. The first difference is this, is the government is no longer seen as obstructionist to people finding their need. That in this particular case, their journey is not a tool of social engineering on the side of the government. But secondly, we need to understand this. The government is the only alternative for this homosexual community. I talk about it. Haters will always be haters. The religious communities will always try to have a more conservative stance. Their parents may be very well influenced by the rest of society out there, and like things like family faith becomes important. Given this, we do not want homosexuals to be completely alone, because the whole point about democracy and the whole point about sexuality in a liberal democracy is that people's self-actualization is being protected by the government, especially when they are most vulnerable.
I think the Deputy Prime Minister, for his speech, does invite the leader of opposition to continue the case in society.
Okay. It screams hypocrisy when, on the one hand, the state says that pedophilia is morally abhorrent and cannot be accepted in any circumstances, but allow enablers for pedophilic urges to persist within society. This debate is not only about outlets and not only about people to pursue their self-actualization. This debate is also about outcomes, and when there's a risk that children might be harmed, ladies and gentlemen, as a consequence of this policy, we would much rather err on the side of caution. Because we think one child being exposed to a pedophilic act is something as worth sacrificing the right of a person to self-actualize. And that is why we think Marvin had to be a lot more sensitive to the outcomes and harms, the tangible harms that Rafiq talked about, ladies and gentlemen. So, we think that Marvin was so engrossed with pedophilic acts that he forgot to take a POI in his speech. And we on the side of opposition unequivocally reject the characterization that pedophilic actions or pedophilic urges is inherent and it's akin to alternative sexualities such as homosexualities and transsexuality, ladies and gentlemen. But even if it is, the state has to prevent it and curtail it, ladies and gentlemen. That is our position, because we think pedophilic activities are unacceptable. Let's look at the first thing that came out from their side, in the frame of the Prime Minister. He said that pedophilia is an alternative sexual design, just like homosexuality, just like transgender. Like in the past, historically, society had negative predispositions towards homosexuality or transsexuality. And therefore, it is unfair for us to make moral judgments on disallowing pedophilic urges to exist within society. We have several responses to this. It is extremely different, ladies and gentlemen, because studies have shown that the nature of pedophilia is pedophilic people that are pedophilic, ladies and gentlemen, is that they went through certain traumatic experience as a child. They were either abused sexually or abused, ladies and gentlemen, physically, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that this kind of experiences that they have went through forces this individual to impose dominance on other children because they felt that way when they were growing up, ladies and gentlemen. But even if it is inherent, let's accept their characterization at best, that pedophilic acts is something is of an inherent urge. We think it is unacceptable even then to allow individuals to fantasize and have the potential of acting out that fantasy on 9-year-old kids that can't consent to these sexual activities, ladies and gentlemen. And it is different from homosexuals because these are consenting adults, ladies and gentlemen, as compared to 9-year-old kids that cannot consent to these kinds of things. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you acknowledge the undercurrent of government's case, the end game of their case is that they want pedophilic activities or pedophilic acts, ladies and gentlemen, to be allowed, just like how homosexual activities were enfranchised within society. That is the end game and undercurrent that come from that side. And from now, we are telling you that that end game cannot exist in society because of the nature of children, because they are not able to have sexual desires at 9 years old, or they are still exploring their sexual desires at 9 years old, and they are not. They don't have the capacity to consent and rationalize the relationships that they're entering into. Therefore, even if it's the end game, even if your representation of pedophilia within society is in view of achieving or enfranchising pedophilia within society, we reject that from right now. Secondly, they said that this is important for an outlet for pedophilias, ladies and gentlemen, for pedophiles. We think there is a few problems with this. Considering what Rafiq had told you, when people are desensitized with simulators, when you get the same response like Siri gives you, ladies and gentlemen, or when you are bored because you know that you're talking to a simulator and you don't get the kick that you want from talking to a real child, we think that the simulator becomes a gateway for them to progress into watching animated pedophilic porn or talking to actual children on social networking sites. And the next natural step is to talk and try their whatever they have actualized online into the real world, ladies and gentlemen. That is why when you talk about pornography, all of our realistic sexual experiences on learning how certain sex position or watching porn, we want to attempt those kind of things. We want to relive those experiences when we actually have sex. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't stop at watching or talking about the sexual activities. You will want to actualize it. And if outlet for self-actualization is so important, why are you stopping short at chat networks, ladies and gentlemen? If self-actualization is so important, then you should legalize pedophilia. Because we question that, where do you draw the line when it comes to self-actualization? Is it okay to flirt with a real child online because you're not acting upon it? We don't think that line is blurred on that side, ladies and gentlemen, and we're not willing for them to have it. So, considering that self-actualization is important, they can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't say self-actualization is only important to a point where you only chat. You can't self-actualize in the manner that you want, ladies and gentlemen, and that is the principal inconsistency that exists under their side. Before I move on to my arguments, yes, sir.
So what about you? What is your value of self-actualization amongst pedophilia? My
value for self-actualization amongst pedophilia is to beat the shit out of them, ladies and gentlemen. If my 9-year-old daughter is being taken advantage of, ladies and gentlemen, if these urges are continued to be perpetuated within society, we think the government must have a strong, consistent stance against pedophilia. So what is important here to recognize is that their policy harms public effort to address public health issues. How is this so? Just like how when the gun issue is inexistent, right? When a child go out and shoot his classmates, for example, the discourse now is diverted towards banning guns as compared to dealing with the actual problems of that person who shot those people in those classrooms. That diversion takes away the focus from society on focusing on guns as compared to the reasons behind why the child committed that act. And we think that diversion also exists when it comes to pedophiles. But secondly, we think that pedophiles can use this as an excuse in court. The reason why I raped that particular child is because the state contributed to it. It enabled me to visualize these kinds of behaviors, ladies and gentlemen, and that plausible deniability will make them blame the state as compared to coming to terms with the crimes that they have committed. That harms the rehabilitation process of pedophiles, ladies and gentlemen, to integrate within society. All these harms are real, ladies and gentlemen. That's why smoking leads to smoking marijuana, and then you take cocaine when the kick is lost, ladies and gentlemen, and then you move on to something else. Same way you'll be desensitized with the simulators where they give you the same answers, ladies and gentlemen, and move on to rape real kids. We would rather err on the side of caution. Please go with side opposition.
As long as side opposition fails to reconcile the nuance between preventing the sin and punishing the sinner, this debate is theirs to lose. Because when we allow the double standard for every citizen to indulge the sickest fantasies in his mind, to the medium of things like games, to the medium of things like movies, and we set that standard for pedophiles as people that cannot even think about their desires, and in Shafiq's own words, let's beat them up, ladies and gentlemen. We say that is the double standard you set for individuals that makes it significantly harder for us in the struggle against preventing pedophilia for children and keeping our children safe. That's going to be the downfall of side opposition in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, and this is why we think Let's look at two issues in this debate. First, what is the effect of our model? Because this is where the bulk of the debate lies, as to whether or not it will be a gateway effect towards being or introducing or incentivizing more acts of pedophilia. Secondly, let's talk about the end game. The end game of the principle, whether or not states can have a moral nuance in between these lines. This is what was run down opposition's line. The first thing they came up here and said was that these pedophiles will be able to visualize the kinds of vivid sexual experiences in these chat boxes. They will be able to get bored with the kinds of things that they get every day of their lives. Let's realize that this is the very same characterization that fundamentally misunderstands pedophiles as groups of individuals that lurk in the bushes and are lecherous and want to prey on children every single opportunity they get. That is a selection bias that side opposition is applying to every pedophile around the world because of the 1,000 that got caught, that victimizes the millions that didn't, that understand the rationality behind, well, we have those desires, we do not want to commit the crimes against children themselves. That rationality, that rationality is the same rationality we assume among every man, common man in the society today. That's why we can let them watch pornography and not expect them to become rapists. That's why you give them access to prostitution and don't expect them to become like people or serial sexual offenders, Mr. Chue. This presumption of guilt is an unfair standard you set for pedophiles when you go out there and say they are different, lecherous, and we cannot trust them to begin with. We say this is problematic. When you can normalize their inclination of desires, we think it's better for them to be able to control it. Why? Because one, you realize that they're able, you realize that you're able to modulate the kinds of behaviors that they have. You realize that these are people who cannot have the kinds of suppressive sexual instincts, and this is something they never defended. How is suppression of their sexual desire a better alternative than our model? When we know the status quo is something that's problematic, they never once told us why suppression is a viable solution for pedophiles themselves. As opposed to what we told you on our side of the house, that if we modulate people's behaviors and regulation, if you can trust a pedophile to understand the difference between committing a crime and being able to actualize his fantasies in his mind, when we allow the same people to do when they play Counter-Strike, when we allow people to watch a Serbian movie, for fuck's sake, and we think that is the same kinds of presumption of innocence we owe to these forms of pedophiles, to give them that particular benefit of the doubt because they haven't done anything wrong. And that is the kind of characterization they've never been able to deal with. They said they will be bored and they'll be able to move on. They want to relive their sexual experiences. Again, micro-focusing on this small group of pedophiles that we think may not be the representation of a significantly larger population to begin with, Mr. Chair. We think these are individuals who even if they get bored, the counterfactual to that is individuals who will never get an opportunity for any forms of sexual release under status quo. How is your model a better system, status quo, a better alternative to a model where you allow them to modulate, where you allow people to understand the difference? So in our model, if you think that abstinence is your way to go about doing so as a a rational adult, that is your choice. And if you think that you need that sexual release, that is again your choice, Mr. Chair. But under their model, you blanket cookie cutter every single individual as someone that cannot control themselves. That is problematic. So as a net assessment of whether or not this model is better for the stopping of pedophilia and preventing children from getting harmed, our model does a significantly better job. Before I go on to my second clash, yes, Rafi.
The difference between your model and other forms of pornography is that people can go out to society and actualize those other sexual desires. If you're so for self-actualization, why not allow them to sex chat with real kids?
No, we think that no, we've already told you. The problem with real kids is the kinds of harm that happen to children, and we think that when you're looking at simulation, there is a fundamental difference of there being no harm with no real children involved, no demand for children in these forms of industries to begin with. There's a fundamental difference on that, Mr. Chair. Secondly, let's look at all the moral bullshit they gave us. They came up here and said it's inconsistent for the state to come up and send a message that when you criminalize pedophilia, but you allow them to legitimize thoughts. But you make that same concession for every damn citizen in your society anyway. We tell you the barometer of your liberties where you prevent is harm. But what happens in your own head, in your own computer, is up to you. Why is that double standard not applied for these people? Why is it illegitimate for every other common citizen? The second response is this. Why can't we tell people that, hey guys, pedophiles aren't really that bad? Until they decide to hurt a kid, they deserve the basic dignities that every human being deserves then too. Why does the state have to choose one extreme option or the other? That is the dichotomy that side opposition would like to have. Oh, we either choose legalized pedophilia or we beat every pedophile up that we can find. And we don't think that is the fair dichotomy. We think the middle ground is being able to access that these pedophiles can be modulated, they can, and the condition can be managed to begin with. The third thing they came up here and said, it's important for us to be extremely antagonistic. A zero tolerance policy that makes sure that we never ever accept pedophiles. Here's the problem. Completely missing out on the point that Prime Minister and Deputy Minister came up here and told you. That very same antagonistic climate you create for every single pedophile in society. When he grows up and realizes his own sexual or coming of age process, he realizes and he's unable to morally reconcile his identity with his sexual urges. That leaves him with only other pedophiles. That leaves him into the darkness of the shadows where he can never find any real aim as to how he manages his conditions to begin with. In a society where he's hated, in a society that refuses to progressively accept that he has not done anything wrong. This is the very same climate that endorses the kind of behavior that allows for repression to be problematic within pedophiles when they realize that this is a society that hates them. This is a society that will refuse to make that moral concession for people that are not yet criminals, that same presumption of innocence you give to every single person. That is the climate, Mr. Chair. If you think you want to protect children, you need to avoid. You need to be able to understand that gratification as a desire is something that's, as per se, is perfectly all right. And it only becomes problematic when children get harmed in this picture. Which means that if there weren't any children in this picture, ladies and gentlemen, we'd be completely okay with pedophilia. We'd be up in arms about LGBT. We'd be calling it LGBTQP in a revolution to begin with. But the point is that the desire itself is fine. And we need to let pedophiles know that. And we think that's a big step in being able to endorse their existence as human beings, give them a dignified living, give them a way to modulate their lifestyles, and for the first time in a very long time, give them the presumption of innocence as we do to every other man out there in society. We're very proud to propose.
We think it's naive for the side of government to argue that there is an arbitrary right to inherit sexual urges, and they use the rhetoric of the homosexual community that you're born this way. Because no one is harmed in the sexual interaction between two LGBT individuals, there's no reason for the state to curb that sexual interaction. But the outcome of a sexual interaction with a child is an insidious, exploitative, and intolerable societal harm. We have all the reason to curb these sexual urges. Bearing that the outcome of your model and your urges is excessively harmful, we ask side government, what other reasons do you have to see that these sexual desires are legitimate? Because if you look at your notes, all that they said was, because this brings me pleasure and you're born with it, somehow it's legitimate. Under their logic, if I kill another person and that brings me net pleasure, the government has no right to bear my social interactions as to how I can treat another individual human being. If I get a sexual desire to do bodily mutilation, the state must provide a platform for me to have the necrophilia sex that is simulated, Mr. Speaker. We say no. When when your outcomes bring an objective harm to society, the state never grants you an inherent right to have pleasure. We curb your desires. There was no other justification in the side of government to say why this right for sexual desires was inherent and must be defended by the state. 3 questions. Firstly, which sites enable pedophilia? Secondly, which site treats pedophilia better? Thirdly, does the right to actualize sexual desires override the protection of the child community? Firstly, which side enables pedophilia, Mr. Speaker? We said that side the House shot themselves in the foot when they wanted a fragile balance between banning pedophilic activities but somehow providing a platform that actualizes the very same desires that contributes towards the very same social harm that you wanted to prevent. We said the clash between repressing urges, does it make it better, or validating these urges, making it worse? We would like to resolve this clash on 3 levels. Firstly, sexual exposure, told by Rafiq, is inherently an activity that you develop tolerance for. Boobs might sexually excite you at 13 years old, but when you're 25, it might not be enough for you anymore. Your actualization of active sexual interaction with a child, and under their logic, has to be real enough to sexually excite them. Therefore, it has to be real enough to normalize that you can have sexual activity with a real child. If you're providing that platform for satisfaction, we ask you, what else if that platform no longer provides them satisfaction due to the increased tolerance of activity? That was the argument of gateway to work actions that they've never negated. Even if the rebuttal is maybe a small group of pedophiles who don't respect the law might do it, this side of the opposition will never take the risk that even a minority of children will be impacted by those irrational individuals who are enabled under your model. Because how do you blame it on individual choices to violate the law when your state had a platform that enabled those desires and validated that you can have sexual activity with children? This state, we doesn't have to prove outcomes on this side. We're just telling you, you cannot have an environment where you enable the sexualization of children. They never negated with that harm. Second resolution of clash. You're validating a societal conditioning that the sexualization of children are perfectly legitimate, that they are legitimate sexual objects that you can interact from. Even if you want to educate them on legal repercussions, you're giving an active contradictory message to the very people that you wanted to treat. So we say it's harmful and you're curbing and being counterproductive for the treatments that you wanted to create. But thirdly, there was a mischaracterization. Side of opposition is not for suppression. We are for the treatment of these psychological disorders. We want them to go away. So this is not about letting these urges continue and then making it worse. We want to engage with these individuals and get rid of these urges because we understand that these urges bring a larger objective societal harm. We don't think we make it worse when we engage with them. Second question, which side treats pedophilia better? Let's look at 3 levels. Number 1 is the nature of pedophilia. They've never negated how in both Rafiq's and Shafiq's speech that pedophilia requires mental treatment, Mr. Speaker. If both sides can require, because this is a disorder that cannot be sustained within a social conditioning, you cannot enable their skewed and distorted values within their mind. This is why people have mental disorders and they're prone to be suicidal or self-hurt. You don't say they have legitimate values. You curb their desires because they're harming another sector of society and you treat them to the best of their capacity. Your treatment is actively undermined when your child porn contradicts the message in the treatment that you wanted to give, which is children can never be sexualized. You cannot validate sexual interaction with childlike beings. Secondly, on the idea of repression. Again, opposition does not stand for repression. They never engage with our recharacterization. We stand for the existence of their communities and active engagement of them. We want them to be recognized as a group. We want them to have a treatment of the disorder. We want discourse as to what causes these conditions. We cannot accept that under their side of the house, that suddenly isolation is a harm that exists on the side of opposition. We do not want to isolate them. We want to engage them as a community. Versus the harm that came from Shafiq's speech, which is that you're diverting discourse in a harmful manner. So now that people become pedophilia, they it's like in a gun debate, people blame guns as opposed to blaming the individual. Now people will say, because child porn existed, and that's why you have a lot of people who are pedophilic. You're diverting away that this is a mental health issue that needs public effort to be addressed. That's harmful for the progression and treatment of pedophilia. But thirdly, on the demonization of pedophiles, we have 2 responses. Firstly, under your model, sexual activity with children is still illegal. Your demonization will still occur. The society will still think it's a social taboo to have sex with children. So just because they can do more harms on the platform, it doesn't mean society will demonize them any less. You're not preventing any tangible harm. Second response to this, we think it is appropriate to place a societal stigma on the pedophiles because it's warranted to be cautious around them. It's warranted for them to be wary with them around child sex, bearing in mind it's illegal. You cannot support that child sex is illegal and then suddenly saying social stigma won't exist because you're still banning their activity and the outcomes of their very nature. We say those demonization efforts exist on your side. Before 6 minutes, yes.
If you grant them the avenue where they can modulate their sexual urges, and then if you say that minority then goes and harms children, we can hold them accountable. Why is there that presumption of guilt to begin with?
I already told you, holding them accountable is something that we cannot take the risk for when you provide a platform that enables them to become in that manner, one. But secondly, you're creating that platform that validates their sexual desire, increases the probability of them acting on a pedophilic desires. This is not about proving outcomes. It's when the state should provide an environment and narrative that enables that outcomes to become more real and more likely to happen. They lost that clash. Lastly, is there a right to actualize sexual desire? We think there has been zero justifications on why there is a right to sexual actualization and why they exist, especially when we tell you objective harms can exist. Sure, they get the most desire in watching children have sex, but it's not like you don't have any alternatives. It's not like you cannot have sex with adults. It's not like you cannot agree, Mr. Speaker, that there's net pleasure in wanking off as opposed to having sex with a child. There's no justification behind why this is an inherent right that the state must support over the interest of the child community. We told you why the state must prioritize children, because number one, they cannot protect themselves. They are victims of no check and balances, then they are highly vulnerable and highly manipulated. But secondly, it is what the state stands for, which is can we or can we not sexualize children? Validating your child porn means we're telling all these pedophiles that children can be sexualized, and that is something that the state can never stand for in this debate. Proud to oppose.
Thank you, Oxford. We now invite Oxford.
Okay. No one in this room can tell you for sure of whether or not pedophilic urges or being a pedophile is something that is inherent or whether or not it is a disorder. Obviously, there's a debate about that, and we had that in our first clash. Therefore, this debate has to be about outcomes and who brings more harms to children and society and who protects them better, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to do that based on two areas. The first one is that, is sexual gratification a right? And should that right be provided and enabled by the state, or is that right for you to practice privately, ladies and gentlemen? Secondly, we're going to talk about the consequences of this issue, whether or not there will be potential that it might be that children might be harmed, or whether or not this will help them contain the urges that they talked about. Now let's look at sexual gratification. Is it a right? We think that it is a right to a certain extent, ladies and gentlemen, but there is no need for the state to provide for you in circumstances where the state, and there is a consensus that that right is harmful to its society. That is why prisoners don't get the right to have sex. That is why the state don't fund prostitution, ladies and gentlemen. That is why the state don't even fund porn, ladies and gentlemen, and it allows it to be private. What they want to do is that they want the state to actively involve themselves in the provision of people to gain sexual gratification and the state involvement in it. And that is problematic, ladies and gentlemen. Because now, we think that there was an unfair accusation on our part, on that side, ladies and gentlemen. They said that what we support is the suppression of the sexual urges. We don't agree. We told you that we will provide state structures in terms of support, in terms of counseling, in terms of rehabilitation in order to deal with this individual. We can't regulate what is in the mind of this individual, i.e. if you want to masturbate and visualize images of children on your own, of course the state can't regulate. You can still do that. But where the state can regulate, ladies and gentlemen, the state should. And let's talk about pedophiles. There are two types of pedophiles, ladies and gentlemen. There are obviously psychotic pedophiles that can't be changed, and there are moderate pedophiles, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, psychotic pedophiles will not be deterred by existing laws, and they will still poach for children in the woods. But when we're talking about moderate pedophiles, ladies and gentlemen, we think that they will be deterred anyway by laws that against pedophilia. But ladies and gentlemen, the nuance that came from that side is that moderate pedophile will be more likely to engage themselves in pedophilic activities, ladies and gentlemen, because of the vivid and visceral nature of the simulators. And we have given you real-life examples of how people want to relive their virtual experience in the real world. And ladies and gentlemen, by showing to you on how people that are exposed to online video games, they spend hours online, they can't differentiate anymore whether or not I'm in the virtual world or whether or not I'm in the real world, ladies and gentlemen. This is problematic because now there is a lack of consistency on the part of the state with the messaging that it's sending. On the one hand, the state is saying that you can access these things and you know, go on with your urges, but at the same time, the state is saying that urge stops when you can't engage a child. That is problematic, ladies and gentlemen, because I told you specifically in my speech, and this wasn't responded to, and this is important to take note, that it harms the ability for discourse to deal with pedophiles. Now the discourse becomes about whether or not they became pedophiles because of the sites that you have provided, just like guns, as compared to dealing with the actual problem. But secondly, because the pedophiles themselves are blaming the state, that the state enabled us to engage these sites, but don't allow us to engage in pedophilic acts. When they do, ladies and gentlemen, they will say that the state contributed to the act that they committed this act. That harms the rehabilitation process of these pedophiles, and we think that's harmful, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of this debate, we have to realistically put ourselves in the shoes of individuals that access simulators and visceral images, ladies and gentlemen. We think it is more likely that one person might act upon what he has seen, what he has experienced on the virtual world because he couldn't get enough. And that one risk we are not willing to take on side opposition. They are.
It's okay, don't worry. We told you from the offset that recognition of an alternative sexual design is something that is necessary. Everything that they've told you so far is predicated on the translation of a sexual design to an act. And we've preemptively discussed this in my speech that just went forgotten throughout the bench. Before I give you reasons of why we win this debate, I'm going to give you 4 reasons why they've definitely lost this. Firstly, they've told you that it is warranted to treat every single person who has this sort of sexual inclination as the same amount of threat to everyone. We think this is fundamentally unfair because, like, by that logic, every other horny man in society should be treated equal as a potential hard to step outside your comfort zone and understand the nature of pedophilia. Secondly, they told us children are susceptible to harm and even a greater deal under our model. And we question, why is that so? They said, no, you're enabling a form of lifestyle and therefore these tolerances will then generally predicate itself. We don't think that's true. What I've told you in my speech was this propagation of abstinence and total abstinence from the offset is far more harmful when you tell people they're not able to legitimize what they feel deep down inside. They said, what's wrong with that? Guys, we've explained this to you. Sex isn't a necessity. But the constant demonization of that sexuality that you have, the constant demonization that you are sick, that there is something wrong with you, legitimizes that sexuality as a focal point. So it is a point of attention for that person. There is a degree of want to actualize the moment you tell that person you can't do so. Right? The probability of elevation of this, the theory of exclusivity kicks into play here, where it becomes far more susceptible for you to do something when you're disallowed to do it. Then they tell us sexuality is not a legitimate right. It is an act of discrimination. We agree. It is not a legitimate right for everyone to express their sexuality. But in this case, when we've proven to you that there is a circumference in which we can protect children from, at the same time give you the reciprocity to engage in that sexual gratification, we never heard a response as to why that was such a bad thing. Then they said the desensitization. People will get bored and therefore will elevate towards these things. That's not an argument to stop pedophilias from enjoying certain amounts of gratification. That is an argument to stop all forms of sexual gratification, masturbation, prostitution, all the like, because there's always a susceptibility. We will get bored and look for more things. That is not just tied in to this debate. Why do we win? One, we're the only ones in this debate willing to understand that pedophilia is an alternative sexual design. Shafiq told you in his speech, apparently, that all pedophilias come from bad childhoods. Even if that was the case, does that mean it is an illegitimate form of expression of what you feel from a sexual gratification standpoint? We never heard why. But we also told you that this offset presumption of guilt is wrong. At the point in which you as a human being understand that you're different from the next guy, that not only do you not love a woman nor a man, but you're into a child, when you understand that, the last thing the state should make you feel is a presumption of guilt that you are evil and that you are a threat. This isn't about the thousands of people that have acted upon this, but this is about the millions that have chosen to suppress this. Ladies and gentlemen, guys, at some point, the blatant discrimination of these people need to stop. We've got to be better than this. We're very proud to propose.